when one looks at radio as a whole in the world, it is a technology that is always searching for a purpose.
What radio can possibly become to compete with the modern technology of the social media? What will they do? And somebody, at some point, we're going to come with something.
I think radio will always be a part of the landscape because radio reaches a unique kind of audience.
Radio is going to be here for a long time. I mean, it's been here over 100 years, and and that shows its staying power.
You know, radio isn't dead. Radio isn't something of the past. Radio is something that keeps connecting people.
Radio is alive.
What's the oldest type of broadcast media in Guyana? If you guessed television, you're still stuck thinking inside the box. I could forgive you for not thinking about radio broadcasting. After all, out of sight, out of mind, especially in a world dominated by visual media. The uninformed may dismiss the radio as outdated and ineffective. However, listeners, businesses, and broadcasters know how impactful the radio can be. Radio is alive and it's still growing. Let's go on a journey into the world of radio broadcasting in Guyana. Radio has over 100 years of history in Guyana. It started as a wired service in the 1920s, transmitting British Broadcasting Corporation (BBC) broadcasts to paying subscribers over the Georgetown telephone network. Shortwave radio replaced the wired service in the late 1920s.
In 1926, the engineers in the Post Office Telecommunications Department in Guyana found a purpose. They started to experiment with this technology, and the first set of broadcasts in Guyana was by telephone. And then in 1927, pretty much like now, like Netflix, if you subscribe to that, you got a headphone or a speaker, and you were able to consume relay transmissions from radio stations in England, United States, and from Holland.
The relayed broadcasts, received from Daventry, England, ran for a few hours weekly until economic constraints abruptly ended the service in 1930. In those days, radio was the best way to get information outside of the newspapers and word of mouth. So, despite its limited weekly runtime, radio was an essential part of the lives of those privileged to hear it. The economic constraints triggered an internal debate about the funding of radio in Guyana, which would ultimately affect radio's purpose and accessibility to the Guyanese people.
The 1920s was also a dramatic change in the nature of Guyanese demographic, pivotal, transformative change. With everything going on in Guyana, the economic crisis brought a funding challenge for radio broadcast in Guyana. And between November and December 1930, radio broadcasting actually stopped in Guyana. And it was reopened in January 1931. And when it started back, part of the ideas at the moment of starting back was that the funding of radio in Guyana should not only be dependent on state funds, but they should explore the use of radio commercials. So by the start of the 1930s, there is in the discussion about radio broadcasting in Guyana, how you fund it. Do you fund it all by the state, or do you fund it by commercial strategies? So when we move into the 1930s, we begin to see two tendencies in Guyanese broadcasting: a commercial tendency and what I would call a public service tendency. And they are going to become more, the differences or the similarities are going to become more evident as we progress across time.
The silent airways in 1930 created a vacuum quickly filled with the cries of the people, longing for the radio to return. That demand birthed two radio stations.
The big news in the 1930s are two radio stations, VP3BG and VP3MR. VP3BG was founded by the Modern Radio Company, which was later called Crystals Broadcasting, and VP3MR was founded by a private company called the British Guyana Broadcasting Company.
VP3BG and VP3MR are reputedly the first two radio stations established in the English-speaking Caribbean. Cricket commentary, music, and religious programs made the stations popular. Behind the scenes, Guyanese were instrumental in the technological advancement of local radio.
When we talk about radio in Guyana, we must always keep in mind Guyanese technological invention. James Leonard Rowe and John Lewis Kerr. These are two Guyanese who developed, who built, who created, who designed, created, and built the radio transmitter for VP3BG.
VP3BG officially came on air in 1935 after the transmitter was installed at Lot 1 Wellington Street, Georgetown. In 1935, the Marylebone Cricket Club visited British Guyana. Cricket had already claimed status as the colony's favorite sport, driving considerable local demand for commentary. This era cemented listening to the radio as a communal activity. Not everyone owned a radio, but everyone would gather at homes, cake shops, or anywhere that had a radio to tune in to big events. VP3MR came on the air in 1936, advancing radio by introducing fresh commercial strategies, which are still in use today.
Among the major investors in VP3MR were bookers and the big commercial houses in Bookers, Wheating and Richter, Fogarty. The commercial sector who saw the value of radio broadcasting as a device for stimulating consumer demand. Also emerging out of VP3MR is the notion of, it's a private sector, commercials, and the practice of brokerage, that is selling of radio time.
VP3BG and VP3MR merged in May 1938 to form the British Guyana United Broadcasting Company Limited, operating station ZFY. The establishment of the British Guyana United Broadcasting Company Limited was led by a team headed by Trinidad radio pioneer, the late Edward Teddy McDowell, who was also chief engineer of Rediffusion and later the manager of Radio Trinidad. Then came World War II.
Guyana was a strategic location during World War II. Thus, radio broadcasting fell under state control, the British government. What emerged out of that was a unit called the Bureau of Public Information. The Bureau of Public Information is ultimately going to grow and become the Ministry of Information, and today the DPI. But coming out of that Bureau of Public Information, as you move into the 50s, is going to be the emergence of a specialized form of public broadcasting.
This Guyanese-flavored broadcasting became the heart and soul of ZFY. The station cultivated large audiences in Guyana and Trinidad. For many Trinidadians, it was the primary source of religious broadcasts and Indian musical entertainment. The station's popularity among Trinidadians persisted beyond September 1947, when Radio Trinidad was inaugurated. ZFY initially broadcasted from the post office, until the Great Fire of Georgetown consumed the building in February 1945. It returned to the ear from a new location at North Road and New Garden Street in Bordeaux. The 1950s were a decade of expansion and transformation for radio in British Guyana. Independence was the talk of the day, and radio kept that conversation alive on the airways.
This is one of the transformative periods in Guyanese independent thinking, this whole notion of being a free people. We see the beginnings of the labor organizing. We begin to see the birth of the trade union movement. And the trade union movement is going to lead to the beginnings of the political process in Guyana. And that agitation for universal adult suffrage became evident in 1953 when we had that first universal adult suffrage election. And coming with that election and process leading up to that was a national conversation about what is the purpose of radio in Guyana. And if you look at the various Guyanese reports that are mentioned in Thomas and these other places, you begin to see some shifts taking place.
In July 1950, Overseas Rediffusion Limited purchased a controlling interest in ZFY. In 1951, more improvements were made, and ZFY became Radio Demerara.
Radio Demerara is one of the Caribbean stations owned by Rediffusion. So Radio Jamaica, Radio Barbados, Radio Trinidad, Radio Demerara. That was a network owned by Rediffusion. For them to get their license, they had to agree to what's called statutory time, which meant that the government of British Guyana would have access to so many minutes of time during various time periods, time blocks, prime time, etc., each day for governmental purposes.
4 years later, in 1955, Radio Demerara moved into its first professional studio, called Broadcasting House on High Street, Georgetown. Radio Demerara was at the cutting edge of the industry at that time. Radio's reach grew further in 1957 when a new transmitting and receiving station built at Sparendam came into operation. In December 1958, a second radio station, BGBS, the British Guiana Broadcasting Service, was established at Broadcasting House on High Street, offering a broader range of programs for listeners.
So that's your 1950s. The establishment of a commercial radio sector that is owned by an external agency but is connected to a regional network. That technological change in the 1950s resulted in miniaturization, and that resulted in a more portable radio.
After Guyana's independence, the government made a splash in radio broadcasting. New professional production facilities were built at Hatfield Street Lodge with the technical assistance of the BBC's Bush House in London. On October 1st, 1968, the Guyana government took over the BGBS facilities, operating the station as GBS, the Guyana Broadcasting Service. The GBS started with arguably the best broadcasting team in the English-speaking Caribbean. Between Radio Demerara and the GBS, Guyana was at the forefront of radio in the Caribbean. With effect from January 1st, 1979, the government acquired Radio Demerara and continued its operations without a break in service. On May 1st of that year, the Guyana Broadcasting Corporation, GBC, was officially inaugurated. On July 1st, 1980, the GBC emerged with its new image of one station, two channels.
I remember there was a guy from Barbados, Mr. Thorne, when he came in the late 80s, and he did work with the announcers, because when I went to radio to GBC, we had Channel 1 and Channel 2. Mr. Thorne, he said, you should change the names of the stations because those more sound like television names. And so the announcers came up with Radio Roraima for Channel 1 and Voice of Guyana for Channel 2.
The FM service on 98.1 went on the air in October 1998. On March 1st, 2004, the GBC and the Guyana Television Broadcasting Company Limited, GTV, merged to form a new company, National Communications Network Incorporated, NCN Inc.
We merged in 2004, and it took like about another 4 or 5 years before all the stations became fully computerized. And those are the government stations, 98.1, Voice of Guyana, and we had Radio Roraima at that time, which is now Vibes FM.
Although radio in Guyana has seen numerous changes, some things have remained the same. Among these is the connection that radio creates between the listener and the broadcaster. This relationship can be one of education, inspiration, and companionship. It could be any one of these or all of these at the same time.
One of the things that I like about radio, this has to do with the community that we're able to build. I equate it to a Facebook page. I love the interaction between the broadcasters and the audience. I like the fact that the audience can say, hey, I'm listening to this. We have a particular teacher would call and say, that program, we heard that program before, it needs to be this one. And it shows that people are depending on what we have to give and they value what we have to give.
For me, as a child and later on and getting involved in radio, was that it always had a bit of mystery for me. You know, I always wanted to close my eyes and imagine what is happening. I think it allows you to imagine. I prefer radio cricket commentary over the television one, and than even looking at it. And I think I would listen to the radio commentary and look at the television because that's a little exciting. I've gone to cricket matches and seen people with their radios to the ear, listening to the commentary while watching the match, and they're live in person. So I think it really does have a place today and in the days to come as well.
There's a sentiment that is attached to radio, and people value their radio. You know, we print some stickers that say, I love my radio, and that is the sentiment we try to capture there. People connect with this body.
Of this woman saying that she calls her radio her little Nikosi. And every day at 3 o'clock, she tells her daughter, who also loves the show, go and bring Lil Nikosi, go and bring Lil Nikosi. So she gets it, and one day her mother wanted to know. So it's a mother, her mother, and her daughter. So 3 generations of people, one household. Her mother asked her, what is a Lil Nikosi? What do you mean? And she said, that is my little radio. That is who keeps my company in the afternoon.
It means that I have a reliable companion, especially for music. I love music and I listen to music a lot. So radio will always be a part of my life, not just because I worked in radio, but because I grew up with radio. Because as a blind person, radio was always there providing me with entertainment, education, and information. And I have a suspicion it will continue to do that for me throughout the remainder of my prayerfully very long life. It has changed me in the sense that I am more appreciative of people's needs, people's desires. You appreciate that people are just like you in so many ways. Despite my blindness, I understand that, you know, human beings, regardless of their walk of life, regardless of their background, their socio-economic, political persuasions and background, they're just like everybody else.
I always said that if I left radio eventually, that I would want to teach, because I think that what we do on a daily basis is teaching as well, you know? Educate, inform, entertain. And during that journey, teach people as well. Our whole purpose is to make everyone better. When you go out, particularly when we go out into the areas outside of Georgetown people busy bad. They ain't got no time with you sometimes. But if you go to Essequibo, you go to Berbice, some places of the bank and so on, you realize the impact that you have on people's lives by just being there, by just being that friendly voice in the morning, in the afternoon, or in the evening, or whenever they choose to listen to you.
How does it feel to know that people are listening? It feels like my job has purpose. It feels like what I'm doing is impactful. It feels like what I do has that personal impact, and it makes me always want to think about how I could do this better. How can I reach out to them more? How can I think about the fact that people are not seeing, they're just hearing, and I need to entertain them for this 3 hours that I'm on air, that I'm given the privilege to talk to them in their communities, in their homes, in their cars, their boats, anywhere they are. How can I be better for them?
Radio is still holding its own. That's hard for me to think about what radio can possibly become to compete with the modern technology of the social media. Everybody's going social media now. But what will they do? And somebody, at some point, we're going to come with something.
There's a metamorphosis that I've experienced. It has to do with taking the radio from just the analog platform into the digital space. And so now there are apps, mobile apps, where people can connect with the radio. Then there's the integration of social media. But the social media and the digital domain, the digital space now, provides that mechanism for feedback. And I've been seeing that marriage more and more.
But I think radio will always be a part of the landscape because radio reaches a unique kind of audience.
Radio is going to be here for a long time. I mean, it's been here over 100 years, and that shows its staying power.
Some people say when one looks at radio as a whole in the world, it was a technology or is a technology that is always searching for a purpose. Radio is always searching for a purpose. It really never becomes obsolete.
Radio is alive. There's some people who feel that radio is dead. Radio is alive and kicking. And we pride ourselves in the fact that we are everywhere. And now our content is being developed for everyone. That ability to reach remote regions almost real time is very important in facilitating the mandate of the ministry. The ministry has been pushing equity in the distribution of education. What is the very important part is the fact that the same quality education that could be experienced here on the coast can now be transmitted to the mountaintops, to the valleys, and to the rivers. We may not be able to take the school and the facility, but the content travels there, and that is huge.
To everything, there is a season, a time for every purpose. However, scattered throughout history are technologies that influence us and change the world while seeming to defy the seasons themselves. Radio communication is such a technology. Its age and ubiquity may underplay its importance, yet its usefulness keeps it relevant in the changing landscape of modern media. Radio is a companion in the good times and a savior in disaster, a trigger for nostalgia and a narrator of current events. All these features create a strong sense of attachment. As long as that attachment still exists, so too will radio.